The prosecution laid out their case first, and this is kind of really the trial of James Burke that never happened. Hi everyone, I'm Eileen Lehpamer, the criminal justice reporter here at News 12 Long Island. As you may know, I've been covering the trial, the federal obstruction of justice trial of former District Attorney Tom Spota and his investigator Christopher McPartland. There is so much evidence and so much testimony at this trial that we haven't even been able to fit into our daily stories. So we thought we would do this kind of reporter notebook look back. And I brought my reporter notebooks, all of them here. I started out small, and then I obviously had to expand. 5 notebooks total. We also have a hard drive here full of video and evidence that was entered into trial, as well as a folder here that included a juror's questionnaire that really read as like a who's who of the county.
For years, Tom Spota and Christopher McPartland prosecuted people accused of crimes. Today, for a second day, the former Suffolk District Attorney and his key aide sat in a federal courtroom as defendants.
When James Burke was brought up in federal charges, he chose to plead guilty. And obviously when you plead guilty, none of the evidence comes out. So all this stuff that had been rumored about in the county and spoken about for years, a lot of stuff that even my sources had told me years before, never came out into the public. So during the openings, they talked, there was a quote, 2 corrupt lawyers. These 2 men abused the power and authority of influence, those corrupt lawyers being Spota and McPartland. They said it was all done to protect their close friend, a crooked cop. And the prosecutor said, why? Because they thought they were above the law. We heard from a detective who worked in the Internal Affairs Division, and he testified to things that had happened to James Burke, and that Tom Spota was Burke's defense attorney in them. So in 1993, for example, Burke lost his service revolver, his gun. He was caught having sex with a prostitute in his squad car while in uniform. He then carried on a relationship with this woman, Loretta Rickenbacker, and then at one point they were out at a diner, this is what this testimony is saying, and that she needed to run home and she asked to borrow Burke's car. He had his gun belt with his service weapon in the back seat, and he let this convicted prostitute that he was in a relationship with take his car with his gun in it. Now, a police officer is never supposed to leave their gun unattended. It says that this was the IA detective says she saw the gun, she took it from the holster and brought the gun into her house. Then she started using crack with her friend. We heard from Lieutenant Michael Kelly, who was with the Suffolk Police Department. He testified he was in the 4th precinct. Then he testified to the fact that after Burke assaulted Loeb, he came out and that Loeb eventually said, quote, some old guy in a suit smacked me. Now, we got to one of the witnesses, KENNETH BOMBACE. He was one of the intel detectives who admitted that he was in the room and admitted that he assaulted Loeb. He testified that 5 days after the Loeb assault, so we're talking about Christmas time in December of 2012, 5 days after, there was a party at HICKEY Castle, and he testified that Burke was bragging about the assault openly in front of the bartender and others. And there was some concern that that could get back to somebody. You also heard from Anthony LETO. Now he's one of the other criminal intel detectives who was in the room who admitted to assaulting Loeb along with KENNETH BOMBACE and Police Chief James Burke. He is hoping to get less time behind bars for testifying against Spota and McPartland. He was asked specifically about did he ever get any unorthodox assignments. And he did say yes, that Burke gave them, quote, unorthodox assignments. This is the intel detectives. He said Burke's girlfriend had a stepson that was giving her a hard time. He had us follow him around to see if he would break any laws. And the prosecutor said, what was the goal? And he said, we were trying to get him doing something illegal. He then testified to when County Executive Steve Bellone became the county executive, that he was told to give him security, follow him around, pretending to be giving him security while really spying on him, and then giving that information to Lieutenant Hickey. And then he said it would be going up the chain to Chief Burke. And this notebook has when James Hickey testified, starting at 10:17 in the morning. He's the government's star witness. He talked about how Burke had John Oliva, Bob Trotta, and William Maldonado, 3 officers at the time, transferred off the FBI's gang task force as retaliation because they were Burke's enemies. December 3rd, Hickey is still testifying. He's under cross-examination now. So they tried to really get on him for a number of things, including his 2 hospitalizations. In the 90s, he arrested a suspect for burglary in Wyandanch, and then Hickey testified that he lied under oath back in 1990. And then he lied to the Internal Affairs Bureau after that about the arrest in Wyandanch of this Mr. Friedman. And his testimony was found to be lies. And so the defense just spent a lot of time on that, trying to discredit him, saying if you lied to that jury back in 1990, how do we know you're not lying now? The prosecution went first, and they really they talked a lot about not only Jim Hickey, because he was their star witness, but they also put up all these points in which other witnesses, they said, supported what Hickey had said about different meetings and different times where he was different places. And they also used phone records to show cell phone calls between McPartland and Burke and Spota and Hickey. They also had cell phone towers, like where it pinged off of. So when Hickey had testified that he met at the Ground Round and that he met at St. Pat's, they showed the jury how all of their cell phones were in that same location and pinging off different towers. But of course, when the defense got up, they said, well, that doesn't prove anything. It just proves they were in the same place, and maybe they're friends. They were hanging out. It doesn't mean what they were testifying to. It doesn't mean that they were talking about a cover-up in those conversations, even if they were in the same place at the same time. The government has got it wrong. They bought the Hickey version of events, and they drank the Hickey Kool-Aid. That was Larry Krantz, McPartland's attorney, talking about drinking the Hickey Kool-Aid. And then Alan Weingrad got up, and he did admit that Tom Spota had a blind spot for Burke because they're friends. But again, he said he did not cover anything up. They all claimed that Burke never told them that he had assaulted Loeb, so how could they cover anything up if they didn't know about it? One of his quotes was, "None of them could believe this crazy allegation had actually happened." Well, as of today, December 17th, 2019, the verdict was back. I was in the courtroom as the verdict was read. This is the verdict sheet. We were there furiously checking off as the jury foreman read the verdict. Guilty on all 4 federal counts for both Tom Spota and Christopher McPartland: conspiracy to tamper with witnesses, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to the deprivation of Christopher Loeb's civil rights. What's actually interesting in all this is today is December 17th, and Loeb was assaulted and arrested by Burke almost 7 years to the day. It was actually December 14th of 2012. It actually came down and people were racing to the courthouse because the jury sent a note at 10:43 and they read the verdict by 11. That was quicker than normal. My cell phone, when I talk about getting text messages, was blowing up with people from all over the county, both in the legal profession and on the political side, wanting to know, is it being read? I want to be there, I want to see it. So the people who were obviously on Spota and McPartland's side did see one of his former office staff actually in tears later on in the parking lot. But other people were celebrating openly. Christopher Loeb was in the parking lot and he was live streaming and saying this was vindication. One of the Suffolk police officers, legislator Rob Trotta, who had been transferred off a task force, he was there saying, you know, this is exactly the day we've been waiting for. Throughout this whole testimony, a lot of people in the courthouse were describing it as, is this the way the police department acts? I think there will be a lack of trust, I guess, for police officers. Are any of these people who were involved still there? Do they still behave this way? Interestingly enough, right after the verdict came down, within minutes, the Suffolk Police Department and the Suffolk County Executive's Office put out statements distancing themselves from Spota and McPartland, and the police department in particular, saying that this is not the same department anymore. Right after the verdict, the U.S. Attorney's Office had a news conference outside and spoke about how these three men, Burke, McPartland, and Spota, were the law and order. How he said the good old boys network of what this county was is dead. I think that the takeaway is that even the most powerful, when you think about Spota, he was the top prosecutor. McPartland, like third in charge in that office, and Burke, the police chief, that nobody is above the law. It may take a long time for it to come out, but everything that was brought out at trial had been sort of spoken about before through many of my sources for years, and now it has come out and they have been convicted.